Good afternoon, everyone. Thankful for you tuning in and using these hopefully in your home and in your personal Bible study as we go through this time of separation. I hope this has been of benefit to you. It certainly has been to me and to our family as we've gone through these studies, and hopeful that it has been to you as well. Before we begin, we've had several others send in pictures and such. I want you to continue to do that, please, if you will. For our 3rd through 6th graders, we do have a few questions from last night's lesson that we want them to kind of go and research and check out. As we covered, some of our conversation was around the discussion between Jesus and Pilate, and so a couple of those questions come from that conversation, as is this first one. What does John 19:8 say about Pilate? We spent a few moments on that particular verse concerning what John wrote about Pilate there. Who did Jesus say when he was talking to Pilate? He said there was someone who had the greater sin. And that's the question from that particular discussion. There's someone that has the greater sin. Who was that? Number 3, what was Jesus' final statement from the cross? We emphasized the importance of that statement in our study last night. And then finally, who came to the tomb early while it was still dark, as we talked about the resurrection and its impact, and how without the resurrection, really a lot of those things that we read and studied about would not have had the same impact if Jesus were still in the tomb, if Jesus would have been dead and remained dead. A lot of those things that we talked about would not have had the importance that they do now in our lives, and so we're thankful, obviously. Thankful for that. Never want to take that for granted. But in this question, who was it that showed up to the tomb early on that Sunday morning and while it was still dark? And then as we move it back into our daily devotional schedule, we talked about this on Friday, that we would be picking up the story of Esther again on Monday. And so that's what we will do today. We'll pick up with Esther. And tonight's devotional will probably be fairly shorter than the others, which I know some of you will probably give me some grief about, because I know that there's the enjoyment of telling the preacher that he can't keep things short and in a timely manner. But hopefully these have been helpful to you, and I hope that you and your family are blessed by the study, not certainly by the messenger, but by the study. And so we want to just look at one brief part of this story. We kind of did this on purpose. I wanted to sort of take this one little account and do it justice, because it's so important to the full story. And again, we've talked about how understanding Daniel and understanding some of the things that were going on historically throughout the period of Daniel and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Haggai and Zechariah. We talked about that a few devotionals ago. How that can help us when we study that. It helps us understand better the words that are on the page. Instead of it simply being something that we read and just go through, now the story comes alive and it becomes something that we realize actually physically took place. And so it's very important for us to grab the whole story and not just the parts that we're familiar with, maybe from when we were a child and heard this particular story. So we're trying to give attention to those things. That's why we spent a good bit of time on Vashti and her importance, and the process by which the king chose Esther as Vashti's replacement. So today we're going to look at this brief passage, verses 19 to 23, and we're just going to make a couple of points for our devotional today. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles, in the presence of the king. So let's briefly look at a couple of things here. First and foremost, let's look at Verse 20, Esther had not made known her kindred or her people. Again, understanding the historical context, you know that the Jews are nothing more than a group of outsiders when it comes to the Medes and the Persians. They're not captives in the sense the way that the Babylonians had taken them captive and had drugged them off from their homes. That's not what's going on now. They are simply residents and citizens of that particular area. Mordecai specifically chose to remain in Susa, in the citadel there, and stay as a citizen of that particular area. So for Ahasuerus, truthfully, the Jews don't really mean anything to him. He doesn't have a hatred for them, but he doesn't have a like for them either. It's not a group of people that he's concerned about. To be quite honest, he's more concerned with his own people and his enemies. And so there's a reason why Esther doesn't make known who she is just yet, because she would have been the only one in this group who would have been from the outsider group. Now, Esther's is the queen at this point. If you look back at verse 17 of chapter 2, that's where we find that she's been made queen. But you have to think about it in her terms. She certainly does not want to do anything or say anything at this point that is going to ruin her ability to influence the king and influence the kingdom. So Mordecai, being very intelligent, understands this and says to Esther, don't say anything about who you are, where you're from, or what people you're a part of, because it's still very important. It's still very early in the process, and Mordecai knows that she's made for great things, and he does not want to see her undercut that. Certainly not of her own doing, He wants her to have an opportunity to, when she makes that information known, that it would not be something that would affect her leadership. Looking at verse 21, by the way, verse 21, other small point, just the respect that Esther had for Mordecai. Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. At this point, she's a young lady. She could, truthfully, do this on her own. I mean, she's a young woman. She is her own person. But the respect and appreciation she has for Mordecai prevents any type of attitude of disrespect or attitude of arrogance towards Mordecai. And when he says something, she does it. And there's something to be said there about the relationship. It has become a father-daughter relationship, even though they're not technically father and daughter. That's what it's become. And the respect that she has for Mordecai in that sense is truly inspiring. And it's something to aspire towards. For those of us that are parents especially, we want to live in such a way that our kids can respect the behavior and respect the words that are being spoken. There's a lot to say there, and we won't go into detail there, but there's certainly a lot there's a big message there that could be given when you have lived in such a way as Mordecai has, that even your adult, quote-unquote, children still listen to your advice because they trust you implicitly and explicitly. So even the things you don't say, the things that you don't do, they understand, they get it. It's just who you are. Your example is that important. And we've talked about that from the get-go here in Esther, the idea of an example and influence. Then you get over here into verses 22 and 23. Mordecai, let's back up just briefly to get the full context. In 21, you get these two men who have decided that they're going to murder the king. That whatever it is that has happened that they're angry about, they're going to murder the king. And because Mordecai is making sure that Esther's taken care of, he's there in and out all the time, and he hears this plan, and he makes sure that gets back to Esther. Two things happen here. Esther tells the king what is going to happen, this attack that's going to be made on him, and that's investigated. It's found to be so, and those men are punished very severely. It costs them their life. The second thing that happens is also found there in verse 22, and that is that she told the king in the name of Mordecai. Esther, while she is obeying and is obedient and is respectful of Mordecai, at the same time, she's also intelligent when it comes to how things are working around her. And rather than go to the king, and say, I have found out this information and I want you to know it so that maybe you'll value me even more. No, she goes and says, this was told to me, but I want you to understand it was told to me by this particular individual. Now, remember the way this all ties together. Remember that she, verse 20, has not made known who she's kin to or who her people are. So this is important for us to realize and recognize that Esther is a woman of honor. She says, look, I'm not going to take credit for somebody else's work. Here's who said it. Secondarily, she does not reveal who she is or why in the world she would even care that a man named Mordecai would tell her this. Thirdly, it's interesting to note that the king takes her word for it immediately, in the sense that he immediately investigates it, and he goes out and he carries that out when we know that this king in particular is really not one who is known to simply take the word of someone else. It's interesting to note that when she says that he investigates it, it's obvious that she's doing things and saying things and talking about things and talking in such a way that she has a tremendous influence on the king. If you go back and you find that's the exact truth and the exact way that she was made queen. If you go back to verse 15 of chapter 2, we spent a lot of time on this. Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women. She won grace and favor in his sight. The word grace there is sort of the insinuation that she could say things. She could speak to him in a way that maybe no one else could. Now, we know that ultimately she's going to have to abide by the rules when it comes to making a request to the king, but it's just interesting to note that she's such a woman of honor that two things there. Number one, she wants to make sure that Mordecai gets credit. Number two, that the king takes her seriously. Now, we know that this king is not one who takes women at their word. He's not one who respects the opinion of women, unfortunately, if you read Esther chapter 1. But yet here, that's exactly what he does. And he finds it to be true, and therefore you see the building blocks, the foundation being laid for Mordecai and Esther to have a positive influence on the king, and that's going to come into play certainly as the story goes along. But I want to make one final point. Mordecai is a tremendous story for you to go look up and research about this man. Not only is he an outsider who is now a trusted person in the city, but he is a wise statistician and a wise tactician. He knows the numbers. He knows that there are Jews throughout the entire kingdom that need to be protected, which we'll cover in more in depth as we go. He understands the statistics of how many people are going to be able to make an influence, how many people are going to be able to get the king's ear. It's not going to come from a Mordecai, a man standing out on the streets trying to speak to the king. It's got to come from someone closer. So he's done the work when it comes to the quote-unquote math of it. And now there is someone in his ear, in the king's ear, who can make a difference in a positive sense. But he's also a tactician in the sense that he's starting to put together some strategy. He's starting to put together some ideas and some plans that ultimately will lead to the Jews not just being another group of people ignored by the king, but rather a group of people held in honor, held in esteem. And that's ultimately what Mordecai's driving towards. He's a man of honor. He's a man that ought to be respected, and he's a man that you and I could learn a lot from. Let me give you one practical piece of advice, I suppose, or a practical suggestion from this short study. If you tell someone that something's going to happen, would they believe you? If you told somebody that something that was going on was real, would they buy it? If you were to tell someone that an event was going to take place, would they believe you? And the reason why I ask all this is simply to say, are you a person of integrity? You see, Mordecai simply said, I heard these two men say they were going to do this. But it's something about his integrity that brings out that brings about Esther going to the king and the king then doing the investigation. It's something about the way he's lived his life that Esther, while I know she's connected to him in a family sense, something about the way he's lived his life has made her understand that he's not just making this up. This is legitimately taking place. And therefore she is willing to go before the king and explain and express and tell what's going on. And so I would simply make that practical suggestion to you to think about, to consider as you study tonight. Are you a person of integrity? Are you somebody that when they say, this is what's going to happen, it's going to happen? If you say you're going to do something, do you do it? If you give your word to somebody that you'll do something, does that actually mean anything? And so I would challenge you to do that. I would challenge you to think through that as you read about Mordecai. And I would challenge you to go deeper and study more about him, and certainly more about Esther as we go along. It would be of great benefit to you. So, encourage you. I hope that you're having a wonderful day. I know that we're all sort of dealing with the stir crazy or cabin fever situation, and probably all dealing with it in different ways maybe. But just continue to pray for those who are sick. We know that there are those who are dealing with this illness in our state and in our area, and we want to keep in mind all those that are healthcare workers, those that are struggling to get things done during this time. We certainly want to pray for those, the Haraway family who have lost loved ones during this time, and just hope that you all are well, staying well, and we can't wait to see you, and we hope that will be sooner rather than later. And just a reminder, if there's anything that we can do to help you, if there's something that you need, if you need groceries delivered, if you need food picked up or food brought to you, please do not hesitate to ask. You can ask me personally, and I will be more than happy to get whatever it is you need and bring it to you, rather than you having to get out. Certainly for our older members, please stay home and please let us help you. We want to. You're not a burden. You're not putting us out. Please let us help you. That's our plea from the church family. It's our plea from our elders and certainly from our deacons and our ministers, and we want to help you any way we can. Please let us know what we can do. I pray that you all have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to continuing our study tomorrow evening.